Hi, I'm Sean Callahan. About 10 years ago, I started to help the Basto with teaching aspiring principals to be better at communicating their strategies, the strategic plan. And the way we did it back then and to this day is helping people translate the strategy into a story. We call it a strategy story. And today, in the 30 minutes we have together, I just want to take you through a process that help you do that, right? Now, it was really interesting back then because it was a new idea. It was something that people were just grappling with, starting to get interested in it, but I could tell straight away that there was a lot of interest in what we were doing and a lot of value that it was created. The idea that you could just tell the strategy off the top of your head without notes, and get it across in a way that people understood why you were taking the choices that you were taking. Okay, and so let's talk about, I guess, let me set the context and talk a little bit about the other reasons you might consider why you need to do this, and then we'll get into the crux of it. How do you go about doing this so you can actually use it in your schools? I think one of the things that this is a real antidote for, and that is, I guess, abstract language that we're seeing all over. You just have to look at our websites to see that we're talking in a way that just doesn't make that much sense to the common reader, okay? I saw this one snippet, if you like, from one website, and it says, we provide a student-centric environment that recognises the unique capabilities of individuals and applies integrated, data-led learning approaches to customise individual learning programs. Now, I must admit, when I read that, I just thought to myself, what is that actually saying? It was hard to get my head around it. And, you have to read it a number of times to really parse the meaning. So much is tried to be wedged into that. And partly it's because of this very abstract language. These are big concepts that are being used. Anything that ends in ION, we should be thinking, okay, there's got to be a simpler way of actually sharing that. Now, I remember a couple of years ago now, I was chatting to one of your SEALs, and he was saying to me that he can really tell if a school is flourishing if the leaders can simply tell him what the strategy is in simple and clear terms, right? And I think that's the test, whether people, when asked what the strategy is, what the strategic plan says, that everyone, all your staff, can just tell it off the top of their head and give some examples of it, right? And I think that's one of the really important elements, is to be able to give some examples, just a couple of stories. So what we need to do then is translate some of those big ideas into just that simple language. And the funny thing is when we share a story, it's very hard to share a story using complex language. Stories are about tables and chairs and things happening. It's not abstract, it's concrete. Now, I guess the first thing that I'd really want to sort of point out too, another reason why stories work so well, right, is their resilience. It's amazing just how much bending and twisting a story can take and still maintain its meaning. There's a classic little exercise you can do with your staff, right? Just break them into two. In the next staff meeting, break them into two groups. One group, share a story, a very simple story, just maybe 3 or 4 sentences, and get them to do that classic game of telephone, where one person just passes the message back to the next, whispering in their ear. And then your other group, just take a random bit of text off your website and get them to pass that back through. My experience is whenever I do that, the story maintains its meaning. At the very end, you could recognize the story. The abstract language that we often use on our websites gets to the other end of that game, it's totally meaningless. There's no real resemblance at the end than there is at the beginning, right? To the beginning. So have a go at that. I think you'll enjoy. You'll start to see just how resilient stories are generally. Now, before we get into the structure, I think I need to really just set the scene by helping you be able to spot stories, right? I call this a curse as much as a blessing because, quite frankly, once you can start to see stories, you see them everywhere, right? Especially from an organisational leadership perspective, stories. Now, our stories nearly always begin with a time marker, right? So as soon as you hear someone say, oh yeah, just the other day, or on Tuesday, or as I was driving in this morning, right? That's the beginning of a story, right? And we kind of know intuitively, as soon as we hear that, it's now in a story mode. If it's not a time marker, it can be a place marker. You know, we're all in the staff room and Jim walked in, right? That's the beginning of a story. Next thing in line, thinking about stories, how to identify them, is stories are always events, okay? This happened and that happened and this happened, right? They're not opinions, they're not viewpoints, they're not perspectives, there are events, always events. So make sure, if you can hear events, you're probably listening to a story. Thirdly, stories have characters. I mean, in our case, it's mainly people, right? Now, we know they're people in their stories because we hear names. We love names in our stories. So when you start to hearing names, people doing things, pretty much good chance you're inside a story. I tell you what the giveaway is, though. If you hear someone do dialogue, right? By the way, we do this all the time in our stories. We'll say things like, so I bumped into Peter the other day, and you know what he said? And then we just do the Peter dialogue, right? This is a very natural way of communicating for us. But here's the thing. You can only do dialogue inside a story, right? So as soon as you hear dialogue, you've got a story on your hands. Dead giveaway. So now we're starting to pick up some of the key elements of what a story is. I'm not saying this is a definitive definition at all. This is just a way for us to spot stories, a very practical framework. Now, you might sort of say, okay, well, let me tell you this. Let me tell you something that's got those three elements: time marker, some events, you know, character, and you tell me whether this sounds like a story to you, right? So I got up early this morning, I had my breakfast and did a couple of errands, and then I got myself together ready to give today's talk. Sound like a story to you? If it is, it's like the worst story in the world, okay? And it's because it's missing something. We intuitively know it's missing something. And the thing that it's missing is that something unanticipated needs to happen, right? And I'm not talking about a big thing. It just means we have to, you know, sort of raise our eyebrows a little bit and go, oh, okay, didn't expect that. Or, oh, that's interesting, that's new, okay? That's what a story is made of. It's made of those events, those peoples and places, but then something unanticipated. So with that in mind, right, I want us now to sort of take that forward into this story structure that I find is really useful for strategy stories. The story structure is got 4 parts, right? It has 4 parts, and it's simply this. In the past, it was like this, then something happened, so now we're going to do this, essentially the strategic choices in your strat plan, so the future can be like that, right? And you can sort of see it's very simple narrative structure. Now the crux of that story sits in the second column, the then something happened, okay? And the then something happened is the events that occurred in your school that got you thinking, gee, we must really do X, Y, and Z, right? So I know one school where their strategic choices are around connecting the community, connecting the students, and connecting the staff, right, the teachers. And they've done a fantastic job on the student side, and now they're starting to reorient themselves on, you know, what's happening with the parents, right? And here's the thing, you go back to then something happened. They noticed that parents were not turning up to events. They weren't there. It was a school that's in an area that's got a really diverse group of parents from all over the world. There's lots and lots of language spoken at that school. And they still hadn't made that connection. So that's their focus at the moment, right? So now we start to understand, oh, so why are we putting so much effort into connecting to our parents, right? Well, because You know, this is what's happened at that school. Then as we move forward, we've got to look at the future. Now, there's a couple of ways of talking about the future. Well, I find that when we put these stories together and help principals put these stories together, the gut approach that ends up in the future is sort of a shopping list. You know, so in the future we'll be connected. In the future we'll have this sort of response and these sort of goals hit, etc. But as soon as you do that, you move away from the story feel of the strategy story. To keep it in that story feel, there's two things I like to get people to do. First of all, think about the future as something that's already happening, but might be just happening in a small way, and you want to turn it and amplify that into a big way at your school, right? So you can sort of say, the future in our schools already happening. We had a situation just 2 weeks ago, and you tell that little story, and at the end of that story, you sort of say, and imagine if we could do that everywhere. I mean, that's an inspiring future, right? And it's a lovely future because you can do it. It's already happening. You've got some teachers already trying stuff out and doing something really interesting. And so that is a great way of talking about the future. Now, sometimes the future is not already happening. Sometimes you've got to imagine the future. And in that case, you've got this fabulous little statement you can start with in the future, when you can just sort of say, imagine this. A student, let's call her Fatima, she walks into the classroom, she's a third grader, and this happens and this happens and this, something that occurs that illustrates the future that you're aiming for, but done in a little vignette, done as a small anecdote, so that when people hear it, they can see it happening, right? And that's what makes it emotional. That's what makes it engaging for people, is when they can see it happening, they can then feel it happening. In fact, there's a little hierarchy of story impact, if you like. At the very base level, your stories are always about something that's happening, right? It's not a story unless it's something happening. But the second sort of level is when they can see it happening. And the third level is when they can feel it happening, right? And that actually comes from when you zoom in. Zoom in, you can actually really see something happening that's making a difference. So they're the four main parts. Now, you can sort of see in my diagram here that at the bottom I talk about moments. Now, what do I mean by moment? Well, a moment is when you're telling that overarching story, it can actually sound a little boring, right? It can be a little abstract, I suppose, because it's about these high level events. And like I just said, you don't get that feeling until you zoom into some specific moments. So you might be able to sort of say, so in the past, we're a school that's got this highly diverse population, and we did some great work in connecting the school and the students and what they were doing, and made a phenomenal difference. But you know what? Then something happened. We noticed that parents weren't coming along to our events, and I know for me, we had an event happening at school, and I walked into the room, and I was expecting probably 50 parents. And in that room, as I walked in, I looked around. There's 5 people there. 5 people, and they were all the standard people who turn up to everything, that come in and help out across the school. And that was the point where I just shook my head and I said, no, we've got to do something about this. We've got to lift that participation rate. So you can sort of see there's a little moment. You can sort of imagine, that person walking into the room and that disappointment, right? Again, that feeling, in case that feeling there is disappointment, that they didn't have the participation they were hoping for. And that gives a reason for your strategy, that strategic choice. Right? So that's what you're doing. You're making these links to these reasons for the strategic choice. Now, where do you put moments? Well, you can put moments anywhere in that story. You can put them in the past, you can put them when then something happened, you can even put them in the so now we're doing this, or in the future. But I tell you, the area that has the biggest impact is the then something happened, because that's the real crux of your story. That's the bit that's explaining the why of your story. Okay, so think about those moments. this is also how the story becomes your story, as opposed to just a general story that's told about the school. Okay, and I tell you what, my experience is when you get people to find their own personal anecdotes, this story just jumps to life, right? It's just quite amazing the difference it feels like when someone can tell their own story. Now, a couple of things on that. I remember working with a group, and someone told me that, hey, I've just joined this school, right? I don't know the backstory. I wasn't here in the past, right? I wasn't here for the big things that then something happened. So I don't have any stories to tell. You know, that's their default thinking, right? I said, look, don't worry about that. Just, had you heard about this school? Oh yeah, I had. Oh, well, tell me what you heard. Well, of course they had their own story about that school. I said, tell that, right? Everyone has a perspective, right? Even if they don't even say anything about your own school, but talk about a previous school, right? It just helps to connect the person into that story, to share some of those moments. Now, if you like the in the past, that's the baseline state. You're trying to sort of set, okay, it was like this. And by the way, when you're talking about the past, you need to honour the past, right? You don't want to sort of diss the past. That's a bad strategy if you do that. You want to sort of say, hey, look, we did some great work in the past. We made some amazing strides. But then something right out of the blue happens, right? It's something that really is the urgency for change, the thing that shifted. That could happen as an external event. It could happen as an internal event. It might be the department that's asked you to do something differently. Clearly, COVID is one big, massive change that we're seeing right at the moment. Think about what those are. And I tell you, don't overload your story. You really only want 2 or 3 things. 2 would be great, 3 maximum. Certainly you don't want to have a big long list of things that affected that change, even if it did, because the story becomes too complex. You've got to make some choices of your own about how you tell that story. Okay. The so now is really the plan that you're putting together. It is your strategic plan, right? But you want to distill that into some, 2 or 3 actions. Again, I once saw a school that had 30 different things the school was going to do. Who can remember 30 things, right? There's no way. The only way you could do that is keep going back to a document. Oh, just one moment. I'm just going to have a look at the document to find out what our strategy is. You don't want that. You want just 2 or 3 things that everyone knows. This is what we're striving for. This is the big shifts that we're making. And then, of course, the future is all about inspiration, right? It's about getting people to imagine what that future state could be and thinking, yeah, that's what we could do. That's the phenomenal impact we could have, right? Now, in this strategy story, don't be afraid to include data, right? Because when you sort of pull together and mesh together your data with your story, you've just increased the power of both, right? Data without a story is meaningless. Right? Story without a data, it doesn't have as much credibility. So you put those 2 together and you've really got something that is powerful for people. Okay. Now, I want to just quickly talk about how you might go about doing this. Right? And I find this works so much better if you co-create it, with the people involved. Now, at a minimum, that is your leadership team. Get the leadership team together and just go through the process, have a conversation. It'll take you, hour and a half, 2 hours maybe, to go through the process of just working out, okay, so what happened? What did happen? What were the things that changed? How's that related to the things? And you want to make these really clear causal links. Right? This is what we're looking for in stories. Stories are about meaning, and we get that meaning through these causal links. That happened, and as a result of that, we're doing this. So you got to draw those links tightly, okay? But get together that leadership team and go through that process. And I would just get you to tell the different stories, all the small stories, the bigger story, and just go through that, iterate it, if you like. Now, if you want to go to the next level, why don't you get all of your staff involved in doing this? And I'll tell you how you do this. Get yourself into a big room, break it up into tables. Each table, let's say you have 6 or 8 people at each table and they have the story structure sitting in front of them. Give them half an hour to each create their version of your strategy story, and then get one person from each table to tell that story. And as they tell that story, everyone else gives a little bit of feedback. What did they like? What really resonated? What were the things that when they heard it, they went, yes, that's it. That's what we're about. And then also get some feedback of the bits that just fell flat. The bits that I don't know if I like that or I don't agree with that. Okay, get those out, and then as the good bits start to emerge, have someone capture that on your sort of like the, a final version of your story up on the wall somewhere perhaps. And then once that process is done, you've got every table has provided their version. It's like the battle of stories, right? So each person is thrown in their story and who's got the best story wins. And so the story starts to come out and that becomes your story. Now here's the great advantage of doing that. Now you have all these people who've got ownership of that story. Okay? They've been part of the creation. They now own it. They now understand it. And even that process of getting them to do it just helps them make meaning of your strategic plan, right? It's a great activity. Now, you might want to go the next step. Why don't you get the community involved? Why don't you get your parents involved in that process? Put out an invitation. Get everyone in a room. Do a similar thing. I've done it for a group of up to 100 people, but you guys could go even further. Just get people to tell the story, that sort of battle of stories. It's great fun. People love to do it. And you will get so much engagement if you go down that path. Now, imagine now you've got your story. People are comfortable with it. You've written it out. Everyone's going, yep, that's our story. But here's the thing. I'm really an advocate for oral storytelling, right? This is not just a story that you're going to pop on your web, as written words. Written words are fine, but they're not half as powerful as getting someone to actually tell that story, okay? And so you want to be able to get people video telling the story. It might be just audio telling the story. And as you start to build that story, you're going to start to discover that for every story that you tell in your school, especially these strategic stories, you will hear anti-stories. Stories designed to beat your story, right? So you might be sort of saying, we're going to get lots of engagement from the community. That's our core part of our strategy. And someone might have a story in their head of, yeah, come on, we did that 5 years ago. We tried to do that 5 years ago and we just didn't get any engagement. The people in this community are not interested in engaging with this school. Right? That might be the anti-story. So you need to face up to the anti-stories, and this is how you deal with them. The first principle to keep in mind is you can only beat a story with a better story, right? You can only beat a story with a better story. And so the worst thing you can do is someone has a story in their head and they come at you with that story and you sort of say, oh, no, it's not how it is. There's 3 key things that we're focused on. You try to beat them with a non-story, right? Opinion, clever argument. Doesn't work, right? You can only beat it with a better story. So you've got to think about, what is this better story? Well, this better story for that engagement objection might be simply that the demographics have changed, that the families have changed, that the situation is different, right? You've got to tell that story. This is how, it's story versus story. And by the way, an anti-story is rarely ever beaten by just one story. It's usually a multitude of stories, okay? So think about what those anti-stories are. Just as you're going through that process of crafting your story, also think about what's happening in terms of possible anti-stories. So now you have your strategy story, you have possible anti-stories, you have a process now for co-creating that information. The last step in the process is really just getting comfortable telling it. And that just comes through practice, right? I would just get people to share the story in as many different environments as you can. As the principals at the school, you'll have lots of opportunity. Each time a new family comes into to your school and you're doing a tour of the school, it's a time to tell the strategy story. Right? Each time you're talking to the department, that's a time to talk to, describe the strategy story. So as you're telling it, you'll get more and more comfortable. But what you really want to do is get your staff also telling it. So when they come to you for resources, sort of say to them, okay, well, just put it in context of the strategy story. Get them to tell you the strategy story and how this fits in. All of a sudden, it just becomes immersed and enmeshed in everything you do. Then what I would do is I would try to find examples of where your strategy is actually happening. And in every team meeting or all staff meeting, I would start with a story of where your strategy is already happening. The idea here is that if you want to change a culture, if you want to change an organization, you've got to change the stories that are being told. And so you want to sort of build this repertoire of stories of that strategy happening. So your organization, your school is just teeming with these stories, right? And then things have changed, progress has happened, and there's nothing more motivating than knowing that you're making incremental progress to that future state that you've defined in your strategy story. Now, I do run a program that you're more than happy to join us on. You'll find us at anecdote.com. You'll find the School Story Lab, we call it, there. If you'd like to come along, please let me know. But I think you've got all the materials here that I've shared with you to give you a good go at having a crack at building your strategy story. And I wish you all the best. I think you're going to have an amazing story to tell. And I tell you, your staff, your students, your community will love you for it. All the best.